Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And today on the show, I'm joined by Kelly Barner, the head of operations and content here at Art of Procurement. We thought we'd do something that we haven't done for a little while and just have a chat between us based on something that we put out there on LinkedIn this week. So first of all, Kelly, thanks for joining me, and how have you been doing?
I've been doing well. Actually, this is probably bad form right out of the gate. I have to fact check you. We actually do this all the time. We just don't usually record it.
Yeah.
This is like constant life at Art of Procurement, is putting content and polls out there and then having calls and Slack discussions to talk about it. But this one we're actually preserving for posterity.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how we're actually going to do today without being able to use GIFs throughout our conversation, because that's usually what ends up happening.
That is true. That is true.
So I will try and channel my inner Mr. Bean into the conversation as we're chatting today.
There you go. Exactly. Mr. Bean is like the spirit animal of Art of Procurement. So we'll take our inspiration from him today.
Yeah. So we're recording here at the end of November. Can you believe we're nearly at the end of another year?
No. And I think the only thing that's keeping me from panicking is that where the holiday falls this year actually means that it's like we have more days in a way, because I think most of us are probably around for a little bit closer to the holiday than we typically would be. Mm-hmm. If this were a more typical year, we'd be looking at, 2.5 weeks and done. So as startling as it is that December is upon us, at least we can eke out a couple more days of getting things done this year before it's all over.
Yeah, and we recorded actually earlier today a live stream on LinkedIn with Vishal Patel at iValue, and we're talking about our 2022 kind of, I don't want to say highlights, but most impactful stories. So
I did think about that. We were talking about highlights, and each of us brought our favorite story, and we had the baby formula crisis, we had modern slavery, and we had inflation. So those are either lowlights or just simply the most important things that happened this year.
Yeah, it's funny, when I was drafting kind of my intro, I was thinking, this is more like lowlights rather than highlights. But actually, challenges that where procurement can make a difference. That goes beyond kind of the traditional types of activities we get involved in. So what we wanted to do today is talk about a LinkedIn poll that I put out there last week, I think it was. Maybe it was Monday, or maybe it was over the weekend. And the poll was around our responsibility to protect suppliers from agreeing to prices that are unsustainable for them. So essentially, do we have a ethical requirement or, just a good business practice requirement when basically a supplier will do anything we ask them for, not to ask for too much? And so the results that we got, and then we'll go into some of the comments and some of our own personal feelings and things like that, were that 75% of respondents said that we should be protecting the supplier, and 25% said no, it's their choice what they decide to give us. So any thoughts, Kelly, on this poll?
Well, I will say that I did vote yes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because now that I think about it, we're talking about whether or not procurement has a responsibility to do something. And yet when I really thought about my vote, I think I approached it as, do you, Kelly, have a responsibility?
Yeah.
And I'm the kind of person that if I go to a store or a restaurant and get something, and then I get back to my car and I realize the cashier has given me $10 too much or something like that, I will turn around and go back into the store and explain and give them the $10 back, because that's not my $10.
Yeah.
And I think that's very much the same kind of ethic that I would apply to this kind of a question. Now, when you put people into the more generalized community setting and incentives are what they are, that's where I think we get into some interesting sort of gray territory.
Yeah, and my so I can say how I voted, and then I'll share a little bit about the context of why I thought this was an important discussion. So I voted yes as well, that it is our responsibility to protect the supplier. Now, the reason that I put this poll up was I actually read an article earlier in the week, and it was in CIPS Supply Management Magazine, and it was called "How the Actions of Procurement Teams Are Contributing to Insolvencies." And the article was saying that, or suggesting that, and I'll quote from it: "The actions of procurement teams are contributing to company insolvencies, as figures show the number of firms going bust is up to 32%. And then a whole discussion around the things that we're doing from a procurement perspective is pushing a lot of businesses into insolvency, into bankruptcy
Yeah.
court. And it kind of reminded me of a couple of instances in my career. One is in the automotive industry, one is in the pharma industry. So in the automotive industry, we'd often have situations where, especially in the direct materials side, where those suppliers, because the market is very limited, ultimately, in the US at the time when I was in this market, you had the three major OEMs, and that was really the limit of who somebody could provide into. And so you had that leverage that if they didn't work with you, then they've reduced their market size by a third. So you have a lot of leverage with them. And I saw times when that amount of leverage was really abused, to be honest with you, in asking for things that were probably not realistic, but a supplier felt they had no choice but to say yes, because if they didn't, then all of a sudden a third of their potential total addressable market is gone, in one conversation. Flip to the pharmaceutical industry, and I had was managing corporate travel amongst other things, and the business that I was with there had sourced a very small business for some of their corporate travel requirements. And that business was so small that when we looked at doing a project to consolidate all of our travel providers, if we pulled the plug, they would go out of business, no
Yeah.
question. And so, in that instance, we felt we had a kind of a moral responsibility not to do that, to put a small company out of business, even though, we probably shouldn't have got ourselves in that situation in the first place. So those are a couple of things that kind of, when I read that, triggered those experiences, which is why I was really interested to see what the community had to say in response to that.
Well, and we are a little bit examining this in sort of a perfect visibility pretend world, because we assume that the representative from the supplier that we're speaking with knows that this will make them insolvent. And we're
Mm-hmm.
assuming that the procurement point of contact also knows that based on the supplier's costs and overhead and hopefully profit margin, which we typically don't have terribly detailed insight into.
Right.
So I think it's a good situation to set up, sort of to discuss in the abstract, but I would actually suggest the most scary thing about this discussion is that in many cases, we are doing this to the supplier without us knowing it. And we're doing it to the supplier
Mm-hmm.
without that individual person who's signing the contract knowing it. And that's sort of the scariest thing of all, is that as much as we want to think we would make the right choice if given all the information, in most cases, we don't have all the information.
Do you think, is not knowing and not caring the same thing, or do you look at those as being different?
Oh, those are completely different things to me.
Mm-hmm.
And, interestingly, it's almost like the more steps a supplier takes to prevent us from understanding their cost model, their cost structures, that kind of thing, in a way, they almost abdicate us of responsibility to
Yeah.
help them. I mean, in some cases, like for instance, I think about contingent workforce where you're working on a cost plus model. There's pretty darn good transparency there, because this much money per hour is going to the person, and this is the profit margin plus overhead that's going to the firm that's handling the service. It allows you to kind of separate those things out. In most categories, you either don't have insight into that, you ask and the supplier won't give it to you, or they're deliberately blurring the lines of what are my costs, what is my overhead, what is my profit margin. And so some amount of it is judgment call on our part, either understanding roughly what their cost structure is, or being able to extrapolate from one supplier to another. If we happen to have more insight at one
Mm-hmm.
company, we're going to know that probably within a certain margin of error, it's relatively similar at another company. we can only do as much as we have the information to figure out.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because oftentimes the suppliers will refuse to give you any insight into their cost structure
Yeah,
until the moment where they're desperate for some relief,
exactly.
and then all of a sudden all the books get opened. Um, and so you're right. If we don't have the insight into that information, then should it even be a consideration?
Yeah, and I would even muddy the waters slightly further by saying that I think when companies don't pay their suppliers on time, that is the first step on the slippery slope towards a situation where you're willing to allow a supplier to become insolvent for you to get the price that you want.
Hmm.
I see that as part of the same sort of ethical or lack of ethical continuation.
Or we could do a whole new show on not paying your suppliers on time.
We could. It's terrible.
Yeah, yeah. Every
Yes.
single business does it,
Yes,
and it's not.
exactly.
And I want to be clear, most of the time it's not malicious. I mean, sometimes payments may be held over, it's the last day of the quarter. And so they're holding over the payments on, the last day over to the first day of the next quarter. So they want to massage some of the financial numbers. But the vast majority of the time, it's process based rather than deliberately not paying your suppliers. And then it's finding the accountability internally of somebody who will try and fix it for you.
And again, I mean, this is where those divisions come into play. If procurement isn't working super closely with accounts payable, isn't sharing systems, we may have absolutely no idea
Mhm.
that we're taking 60 or even 90 days to pay a supplier who has 30-day payment terms.
Yeah, the first time I would often find that out in the manufacturing space was when, I got an angry email from a supplier saying they're going to
Yep.
stop shipment.
Yep, exactly. And then we go in thinking we have a good relationship. Hey, can
Yeah,
I ask you a favor? And the supplier's like, you haven't paid me in 3 months. Why would
right.
I even take your call?
Yeah. So we got a lot of interesting comments from the community when we posed
Yes, we did.
um, it, and so I'm going to ask you first of all, any that or pick one that stood out to you.
Well, my favorite comment, I love this. It was probably the shortest comment that we got, but I thought it was just right to the heart of the matter. This comment from Taj, or I should say it's a question: would the supplier stop the buyer from overpaying?
Hmm.
And as you and I were chatting previously, I think we know the answer to that
Right.
question.
Yeah. I think that's for sure. I wouldn't anticipate that this the supplier, is trying to maximize their income from you, and I would very much doubt that somebody's going to tell you that they're, that you're paying too much for that service.
And then but if you take it to the point of, if we try to play this out, is there a way that the supplier could know that if you pay the price they've asked, it will put you into bankruptcy?
Hmm.
Can you sort of play the fully mirror opposite? I
Yeah.
mean, you would have to think that just like we're relying on some amount of responsibility on the part of the supplier to say no if they have to say no, a supplier would probably think, hey, if this company really can't afford this, they're going to downgrade demand, downgrade service levels, push out the purchase, try to make some kind of a change. I always think it's interesting when you can take a situation like this and flip it over and look at it the other way and find differences. I thought this was a super interesting response from Taj.
Yeah, I'm reminded actually of a podcast that I did either late last year or early this year with somebody called Chris Melee, and Chris is a leads a business that helps software companies price their services or price their software
Yep.
essentially, and that's a business where the pricing can often seem extremely arbitrary, based on what's somebody willing and able to pay for. And he was talking about ethics in pricing, during that conversation. So I think it is something that's discussed when, in line with overall product and pricing strategy, but probably not as much at an individual customer level.
Right. Now, were there any comments or questions or feedback that really stood out to you?
Well, one of the things I'm looking at right now is from Embry Davis, who is another AOP alumni from Procurement IQ. And Embry says this is a tough question. I think it comes down to ethics, values, and morals. But do you believe that every supplier deserves the right to a fair profit? So that's really interesting to me,
Yeah.
because we'd again in the manufacturing side when we were doing cost modeling or getting cost breakdowns from suppliers, there was always this debate about what's a fair profit margin. And obviously, what you as a buyer think is a fair profit margin may be different than what a supplier thinks is a fair profit margin. Um, how do you feel about that? Does every supplier deserve the right to a fair profit?
Well, I think they do, but I think it works both ways. I mean, on the one hand, all of us should want well run companies to be profitable. On the other hand, the company has to be run well enough to be profitable. I mean, you can take a company and have it, on the one hand, run by a very efficient team that's good with the books and keeps track of their investments and makes appropriate growth decisions. Or you can take a company, actually, I'll pull an example somewhat from the headlines. You know, you look at a company like Peloton that thought because everybody was locked in their houses for 18 months that they were going to continue on that growth trajectory forever. And they hired everyone and invested in all this inventory. And oh gosh, the minute we were allowed out of our houses again, people went back to gyms and spin classes.
Mm-hmm.
And so things changed and they had to restructure. So their responsibility in returning themselves to a fair level of profitability had to do with downsizing and changing their operational plans. It's not to say that they should get to keep all of those people employed as much as they might like to, and then everyone that owns a bike should pay $3,000 a month
Right.
in order to give them that fair profit. There's still sort of that handshake around, yes, we understand you're going to make money. And as long as it seems like a reasonable amount, we're going to be happy for you. But you should also do all of the right things operationally and administratively inside your organization to make sure that you can function as a company inside of what is sort of generally agreed upon to be an
Mm-hmm.
appropriate profit margin.
Yeah, and there's some comments that we had around. Gavin is one example. What good comes from a supplier? What good comes when a supplier is led into bankruptcy or closes its doors? And it's interesting that we spend a lot of time doing financial health assessments of our suppliers and doing financial risk monitoring, um, without necessarily considering sometimes that we could be the one of the reasons behind their financial health performance.
Yeah.
The price structure that we have in place with them, especially again with smaller businesses. When you're working with smaller businesses, not so much when you're working with huge organizations, but our actions can have direct impact on the financial health of a business. Fred Stasia, Fred is a former business partner my stakeholder from a long time ago. I was talking to you before the show about this, probably 12 years ago, maybe 13 years ago. So it was great that Fred popped in with a comment, and Fred said that, if I'm doing this and I'm really trying to take advantage of everything I can take advantage of from a pricing perspective, I can guarantee I'll be nickel and dimed for the duration of the term. And I'll be guaranteed that I'll be paying much more on the renewal, especially if they've embedded what they're doing into his processes. So you end up giving away your negotiating position the next time around.
And I think that's great, actually, partially because you worked with Fred so long ago.
Mm-hmm.
Fred, if you're listening to this, call me. I want the dirt on 12 years ago, Phil. But, and it is interesting as you look across these comments, Fred is absolutely right. I mean, I think about this joke we used to tell in the office when I was in consulting, because you go through and you have these enormous expense reports because you're on the road for so many days and every single thing that you consume is, ultimately expensed back to the company within reason. And there was this joke we used to tell about a guy who traveled someplace hot. And so he bought a hat to shade his face. And finance or whoever it was said, no, that's not an appropriate thing to expense. We know you're in a hot place, but there were other options. You shouldn't be expensing this hat. Do it again. And so he sent back the expense report
Mm-hmm.
with a note on the bottom that just said, find the hat.
Right.
right? You know the hat's in there. And we as procurement would know the exact same thing. If you want to spend the duration of the contract looking for the hat, be that supplier's
Yep.
guest, because they're going to find a place to like, okay, well, if I shift this around a little bit over here, shift that a little bit around over there are so many numbers and things we don't have visibility into that are ultimately behind the price of any single
Mhm.
item, let alone a contract that includes, some type of service or multiple items or rebates based on volume. There's so many moving pieces. If you're really difficult, sure, they'll find a way to keep you, but you are paying for that.
So, given all the comments, we said at the beginning how we answered that poll. Is it our responsibility to protect a supplier from agreeing to prices that are unsustainable? Are you sticking with your answer?
So I think I'm sticking with my answer again as Kelly. As
Mhm.
I look back at the poll itself, like you said, 75% of people said yes, it's our responsibility to protect the supplier. 25% said no, it's the supplier's choice. That is 1 in 4. And it's definitely the vast majority who have said we need to do the right thing and protect the supplier. But I actually find it interesting that 1 in 4 people were willing to say we don't have as many comments from them reflected in the
Mhm.
discussion, which is interesting. But that no, there's 25% of people that participated in this are still willing to say, nope, that's not my job. You need to negotiate for you. I need to negotiate for me. We're both responsible for our own side. I actually think that's sizable given the general conversations we have in procurement these days about being a customer of choice and relational procurement and win-win negotiations. I actually think it's really interesting that that many people said no, and I am
Yeah.
positive that there are both good stories and valid reasons behind people choosing that option.
Yeah, and something that you said earlier about the availability of information, I can certainly empathize with the point of if we don't know any better because we don't have insight into the information,
Yes.
you know, why is it something we should consider?
No,
Because we
I,
just
I
don't,
think that's valid.
because we don't have the information. Now, if it's in a situation where, I shared the pharmaceutical industry situation where we had essentially put a lot of eggs in the basket of a very small supplier, then I do think that we have an
Mm.
ethical responsibility to, if we're going to move business away from them, for example, to do it in a very structured, perhaps long-term view where it provides them the opportunity to find other suppliers or to diversify their revenue base, much like you would do, if you are, laying off an employee where you're trying to give
Mhm.
a cushion and all the support you can do for them to find another job. When it's working with suppliers where it's not really clear what the cost and the impact and everything is, then yeah, it's very difficult for us to be able to make that choice because we don't have the information that will determine whether we are putting them in an unsustainable position or not.
There is also a time element to this. Depending on what you're buying and what the supplier's costs are ultimately driven by, some suppliers' costs are very volatile,
Hmm.
right? If you have lumber, if you have steel, right? If you have that kind of thing where it's traded on a global commodity market and it's all over the place, part of that supplier's capability is being able to level out all of
Yeah.
that flexibility into way they manage inventory and capital and pricing and all of that. And so that's part of what that supplier has to figure out to be able to do. But there's also cases where procurement will have an expectation. No, we buy a lot from you. And so we want you, we'll say continuous improvement, because that makes it sound nice. We want you to invest in continuous improvement where every single year or every
Yeah.
single contract term, without fail, you are coming back to us. And at least the exact same thing is going to cost 2 to 3% less.
Hmm.
I think those two things are also very different expectations because one is a short term, something is perhaps outside the supplier's control. There could be tariff issues, there could be some sort of market spike that's creating a bad situation. And then you would like to think most people would work together to get through that because it's temporary. It's another thing where, as procurement, if it's literally part of your buying strategy to expect this year over year over year, you do get to a point where they can't really take out the 2 to 3%
hmm
cost without changing the spec.
Yeah, or the only reason they can take it out is because they inflated the price in the first place.
And there's no reason to incentivize that. And yet, indirectly, I mean, let's face it, procurement teams have reputations.
Yeah, well, in the manufacturing side, and again,
Yeah.
this is just my experience, and this was a long time ago. We would be building 2 to 3% year over year cost reductions into any long term agreement that we signed, because that's how we were in. That's how our performance was measured. So if our performance is measured in, like, you've got a goal this year of, let's say, 2 or 4%, then you know that you've got those reductions because you built it into long-term agreements with your suppliers.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like it's implied that they can take that down because the starting cost is probably higher than it needs to be. And so with paying more money because for a metric, as opposed to because that's what something actually should cost.
Right. No, and it also is unwise on procurement's part or the corporation's part to assume that suppliers don't have a voice in this. I mean, you and I had a conversation earlier this year that we shared where it wasn't so much about expecting the supplier to necessarily drive down costs in order to hit a fixed price point. It was more around holding inventory,
hmm
altering order size, and bearing transportation costs. And those suppliers of very large retailers, I might add, went directly to the press.
Yeah.
And I mean, certainly that is a great way, I guess, great way to get your message out, depending on what you're looking to achieve. But you don't even need that. In this age of social media, if you have a savvy person on your staff, you can reach a very large audience and create some real brand damage, even without having a major media interview. And so it's another one of those things procurement needs to have in the back of their minds. Even if you are willing to take a risk and put this pressure on a supplier, what does it look like if that supplier decides to go public, particularly if your company is B2C? The
Yeah.
brand damage there could be far more costly than just allowing the supplier to charge a little bit more per unit.
That's a fascinating kind of perspective that I never really even thought about before. That reputational risk that in the past, those negotiations were, behind closed doors between two parties, and nobody ever found out about it beyond those two parties. But yeah, if that kind of if your style and the approach that you've taken and it puts companies out of business, or you're asking for unrealistic things, then absolutely there's reputational risk associated with that today, with the way that nothing is ever in private anymore.
No, absolutely. And that's when you get consumers, even if they didn't buy from this supplier or don't buy from you, they hear the story. My goodness, especially at the holidays. And they think, oh, and then they turn and look at this big, mean, nasty company that did this horrible thing to this wonderful little supplier who has very nice people working for them, right? The people tend to judge quickly in these kinds of situations. And the benefit of the doubt is never, never, never going to the really big corporation out of the bat.
Well, we went on a journey today to starting with the poll, but also some really interesting points as we're kind of discussing what our responsibility is to protect our supplier from unreasonable asks. So, Kelly, I want to thank you so much for joining me. A really interesting conversation, and we should do more of it. Let me say, we should hit record on more of these
We
in the
should
future.
record more of these. I know we have loads of these conversations. Somebody has to have the discipline of getting into the habit of hitting the record button
Yeah.
before we start.
Well, thanks everybody, as always, for listening to today's show. And we look forward to being back again next week. Kelly, thanks once again for joining us today.
It was my pleasure, Phil. Thanks.
Thanks. If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.